1000 years, matlab, in the year 100 and something.
1000, right? So
Yeah.
we went over
So
in the first lesson. I'm going to repeat it to everybody. When you're talking about the year 1020 or 1030, you are talking about the early 11th century, right? So that's how you can say it.
So in the early 11th century, India was raided by two forces from opposite sides, and there was this force. There was this Chola Empire from the south, and then there was this Ghaznavid Empire from the west of India. So they were. It said that they would raid in the inside of the central India. चोला एम्पायर जो था वो ऊपर बंगाल तक पहुंच गए थे, and they would, like, loot and plunder various temples and riches, and then they would bring them back to their capital. So जो चोला एम्पायर का जो इस वक्त वो था लीडर था, he was the son of a previous Chola emperor who was also very famous for, was very famous. So what he did was कि he went to central India, गंगा तक पहुंच के वहां से मटकियां भर के वो वापस इधर लेके आया था, and so he got a name because of that. मतलब this is something like he was being synonymous to Shiva. Sorry, I don't know Shiva, but some other god who also, like, rained down this river Ganges to, irrigate this land. तो उसने उनके बरक्स ये काम अपने उसमें किया कैपिटल में. तो इसी साइड पे पैरेलल टू दिस वो वेस्ट से फोर्सेस आ रही थी, एंड दे आल्सो वेंट टू सोमनाथ का मंदिर तक पहुंच के, जो गुजरात में है, वहां तक वो आए और उन्होंने क्या कहते हैं मुख्तलिफ चीजें जो थी वो प्लंडर की. एंड आफ्टर दैट व्हेन दे वेंट बैक, तो अब हुआ क्या कि हिस्ट्री के अंदर अब जो दूसरी फोर्स थी जो वेस्ट से आ रही थी वो मुस्लिम थी, और जो इधर से आ रही थी देवर हिंदूज, बट बोथ ऑफ देम, मतलब उनके दरमियान ये डिफरेंस है, बट बोथ ऑफ देम looted and plundered, various temples and riches, and went back to their own places. मतलब थोड़ा सा उन्होंने अपने वहाँ पे एस्टेब्लिश किया था, बट इवेंचुअली दे वर रूलिंग फ्रॉम देयर सेंटर्स, देयर कैपिटल्स, एंड वहाँ पर उन्होंने जाके ये चीजें मतलब स्पेंड की. तो अब हिस्ट्री जब ब्रिटिश आते हैं इनको किस तरह लेबल किया जाता है कि जी एक तरफ जो थे वो मुसलमान जो थी, मुस्लिम इन्वेजन कहा जाता है इसको, जब ये ब्रिटिश ने आके इसको लेबल किया. और वो इसलिए किया क्योंकि जब ब्रिटिश उधर अफगानिस्तान तक पहुंचे थे तो उधर उनको मतलब शिकस्त हो रही थी, और अपनी इमेज अपने हिंदू सब्जेक्ट्स के दरमियान बेहतर बनाने के लिए उन्होंने ये कहा कि हम जो हैं उधर जा रहे हैं, इनके कैपिटल जा रहे हैं जहाँ पे हमें मिले हैं कि सोमनाथ के मंदिर की कुछ दरवाजे हैं जो अभी तक वहाँ पड़े हुए हैं, तो हम उनको वहाँ पे रिट्रीव करने जा रहे हैं ताकि हम अपने हिंदू सब्जेक्ट्स को वापस दे सकें. तो उनकी ये कोशिश कि वो अपनी इमेज बेहतर बना सके वो नाकाम हो गई, लेकिन उन्होंने एक इस तरह का प्रेसिडेंट क्रिएट कर दिया दैट सॉर्ट ऑफ डिस्टिंग्विश्ड दिस अटैक फ्रॉम द वेस्ट, एज इन कि मुसलमान जो थे उन्होंने मतलब हम पे कब्जा करने की कोशिश की और हमारे साथ ये किया और उनको कुछ किया. हालांकि this was very common in India कि temples were raided, and all the time temples were raided and different empires sort of raided each other, and इसमें ऐसी कोई बात नहीं थी, तो उसमें ऐसी कोई डिस्टिंग्विशनेस थी नहीं जो उन्होंने डाली. तो उसी के बाद से फिर ये मतलब उनकी ये नैरेटिव उन्होंने क्रिएट कर दिया, तो इसलिए अब हम इनको इस तरह रीड करते हैं.
Thank you, Ali. That's actually the most important point that he made at the end, guys. Because in this period, raiding your neighbors and particularly raiding temples in India was a very common, everyday, almost like a normal practice. It wasn't in its own context, right? In its own historical context, it wasn't necessarily such a big deal. But in the 1840s, the British used the story of Mahmud's raiding of the temple of Somnath to create a little bit of a PR campaign for themselves, having lost a terrible war in Afghanistan. They picked up these gates, which were really like about 100 years old and were totally Afghani. But they said, हाँ हाँ ये वो वही gates हैं जो महमूद सोमनाथ से उठा के ले गया था, और बहुत फैन फेयर के साथ वो गेट्स वापस लाए गए इंडिया, और दिल्ली में बहुत बड़ी तकरीब हुई, एंड देयर वाज लाइक अ पब्लिक अटेंडेंस ऑफ मिलियंस इन व्हिच the gates of Somnath were officially handed back to the nation of Hindu nation of India by the British, and so on. Tayyaba.
Okay, I think Ali pretty much summed it up. But the first raid was in 1022, and by a general on the authority of Rajendra I, who was the Maharaja of the Chola Empire, and he came from the capital of Tanjavur and headed southern towards the south end of the Indian peninsula. And among other things, as booty, he also took images of deities. And second was by Mahmud of Ghazni in 1025, who came from eastern Afghanistan, and he then headed southeast to the Suleiman Mountains, and he planned to attack the wealthy temple of Somnath. So both of these events were similar in the sense that both of them had a specific North Indian target to attack in mind. And the difference was that in the way they attracted audience. The the Chola Empire's attack was forgotten. It was just considered the usual out of so many. But the attack by Mahmud was, as you mentioned, brought up by the British to cover up their defeat in the Afghan war, and that fueled the Hindus' ill feeling towards Muslims.
Okay, Arisha.
Yes, can you hear me?
Ji.
Yes. Ma'am, Rajendra Chola and Mahmud of Ghazni has many similarities like discrediting royal temples, clearing off plunder images with no intention of occupation or permanence. However, I feel the main difference was the Chola's political culture is built upon Sanskrit texts that circulate across India for ages, whereas Mahmud's culture was informed by Persian texts that came just 2 decades before Mahmud's day.
Thank you. Yes, that's exactly where the chapter proceeds next. Arisha, that was you now who just spoke. You can put your hand down.
Yes, I was.
Okay. Okay. So just to quickly recap what everybody said very nicely. Back to our familiar map. Can you see my cursor, guys?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
All right. So around here, right, this Godavari river, between the Narmada and the Godavari, somewhere here is where the Deccan Plateau exists. And where the Deccan Plateau begins, North India ends. ये इसको हम Central India कहते हैं, Deccan जो है, और फिर ये बिल्कुल Southern Peninsula है नीचे, जो बिल्कुल ये triangular tip नीचे निकलती है. ये जो बहुत बड़ा एरिया है ऊपर नॉर्थ इंडिया का, जियोग्राफिकली हम इसको कहते हैं the Indo from Indus Gangetic plain from Ganges. Okay, so this whole thing like this is the Indo-Gangetic plains. और जो हिंदुस्तान प्रॉपर है ना, जो फारसी में लफ्ज पड़ा हिंदुस्तान, that actually refers to this North Indian Indo-Gangetic plain. Indus और गंगा की जो सारी river valleys हैं ये ऊपर. So between the Deccan and the Himalayas, this whole region is Hindustan. Now, Mahmud of Ghazna, ever since the 1840s, when the British pulled this PR stunt, has been remembered internationally and by Indian Muslims and by Indian Hindus. They all concur, they all agree. सब अंग्रेजों की बात मान गए, मुसलमान भी मान गए कि कोई बहुत खास चीज हुई थी early 11th century में. ये मतलब बहुत ही बहादुर खूंखार जंगजू मुस्लिम गाजी आया था अफगानिस्तान से. See, here's where everybody came from, the Khyber Pass. See it? यूं करके आते थे लाहौर तक. So Mahmud, the great Ghazi, supposedly arrived in Hindustan for the same supposed reasons as Muhammad bin Qasim. ठीक है, कहानी वही है, आपको भी मालूम है, मुझे भी मालूम है, that he came to teach a lesson to this land of infidels and idol worshippers, and he came to bring the message of Islam to them, but he brought it through Ghazwa, right, as a Ghazi. And what was the biggest lesson he taught them? He went to their greatest temple. Dekho, here's Somnath. Huh? This is Gujarat. He went to their greatest, richest temple and he destroyed all the idols. ठीक है, तकरीबन 200 साल से ये कहानी हम सब सुन रहे हैं, मान रहे हैं. जो कहानी कोई सुनाता नहीं है, अब जाके थोड़ा सा हिस्टोरियंस ने इसको उछालना शुरू किया है. इसके उसी वक्त, बिल्कुल उसी वक्त, इनफैक्ट a little before him, there was a Hindu Kshatriya Rajput dynasty right in the south of India here. That Kshatriya dynasty was the Cholas. They were rather rich and successful and powerful. And they also mounted a serious raiding expedition to North India. But वो ये by sea आए थे, ये यहाँ से निकले. They sailed up into the Bay of Bengal and attacked from here. This area, Bengal and Bihar, was under another Hindu Kshatriya dynasty called the Palas. सबसे पहला obvious lesson तो इसका ये है कि Cholas और Palas दोस्त नहीं थे, हिंदू भाई भाई नहीं थे, right? They fought war. These guys attacked these guys who defended themselves. Not only did they attack, did the Hindu Cholas attack the Hindu Palas, they did exactly what Mahmud is credited with doing. They destroyed their temples, they destroyed the idols in the temples, and they walked off with a bunch of those idols. So then, what makes Mahmud's raids different or special? The first answer to that is, yes, go ahead, Sarim.
He was a Muslim, and it adds a more flavorful, it makes it it seems that this is a religious thing rather than just an army thing, which all armies.
It's actually deliberately, consciously manipulated to look like that. Ramin?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but like Mahmud's raid was kind of from outside India, like from Ghazni, and this one was more internal.
That's, thank you for raising that point. What it reminds us is that nobody thought of India as being some kind of national entity. The Cholas did not identify with the Palas as fellow Indians. Because remember, there is a reason that the Indian subcontinent is called a subcontinent. It's not merely the geography of it. It really is a small continent. It's like Europe. So the Cholas would have thought of themselves as a self-contained unit with no allegiance to anybody else, certainly not on the basis of a shared religion, certainly not that. Political alliances for practical reasons, yes, they believed in those. But there was no sense of एक इंडियन दूसरे इंडियन पे हमला कर रहा है. ये बहुत एक मॉडर्न तरीका है इसको देखने का. ये सवाल भी सिर्फ आप ही उठा सकते थे, sitting here today in the 21st century. Sarah and then Iman.
Another factor was how both the events were framed in terms of how the Persian literature told the story of Mahmud of Ghazni as being a person who was against Hinduism, and they interpreted it that way. Whereas the Sanskrit literature did not really focus on the Chola raid, and it was seen as usual. So the same Persian literature was then interpreted by the EIC to kind of take into for their motive.
I will get to that. Thanks for bringing it up, Sarah. This is a matter of rhetoric, और थोड़ी सी आज हम rhetoric की बात करेंगे. Iman?
Okay, so another reason was that during the early 20th century, when political tensions between Muslims and Hindus were on the rise, so that is when both these parties began to look at history and started looking for villains and heroes, from their own religion, and then used that for their own political benefit.
Absolutely. Huzaifa?
अच्छा, तो जैसा कि सोमनाथ का और सारा ने बहुत अच्छा मतलब पॉइंट उठाया कि पर्शियन लिटरेचर में इसको इस तरह मतलब उछाल कर पेश किया गया, लेकिन जब सोमनाथ की बात आती है तो सोमनाथ एक पोर्ट था और जो है ना वहाँ पर मंदिर भी काफ़ी मतलब अच्छा था, आलीशान था। तो वहाँ जब महमूद की रेड के बाद के जो अहवाल मिलते हैं वहाँ के जो रीडिंग में है, तो वो भी कुछ ख़ास उसका तस्करा नहीं करते हैं, ठीक है। और उसके बाद महमूद की रेड के बाद फिर हमें मालूम होता है कि भाई वहाँ पर एक किला बन रहा है और उसकी वजह ये है कि भाई जो दूसरे राजा हैं यहाँ वो उसके ऊपर हमला ना कर दें। तो यानी ये कि ये एक कोई मतलब एलियन चीज़ नहीं थी, मतलब ये उसके कल्चर में था, इंडियन कल्चर में, कि मतलब मंदिरों को लूटना और इस तरह
Thank you, Zephyr. You obviously read carefully and you read ahead. So guys, there is, as you move on, Eaton does what any good historian should do. जिन जिन लोगों ने historical methods की class ली हुई है, you know that in order to get a more balanced picture of any historical event, a historian needs to consult a variety of different sources. And ideally, those sources should be coming from very different points of view. So, महमूद के कोर्ट में, गजना में, जो दरबारी तारीखें लिखी गई और दरबारी तारीखें लिखी जाती थी, that was part of Islamic culture. Tarikh was a respected genre in Islamic culture, and there's a vast literature of Tarikh in Arabic and Persian. और ये जो genre है history writing का, तारीख का, in the Muslim world, it has its own conventions, its own jargon, its own rhetoric, just like any discipline or genre, even today, right? Those of you who study business, those of you who study accounting, those of you who study psychology, you're in very technical fields. There's a certain set of terminologies that you use there. There's a certain way of speaking that you use there that is only understood amongst those people who are in that field or familiar with it. So, दारुल इस्लाम में जो तारीखें लिखी जाती थी उनका एक रेट्रिक होता था और वो रेट्रिक जो था it tried to always create a religiously based legitimacy for whatever Muslim ruler they were writing about. And the model, of course, was the very early Islamic literature that documented the Arab expansion, the Muslim expansion inside the Arabian Peninsula. बिल्कुल शुरू में and certainly the battles and wars fought by Rasulullah himself. तो ये जो लफ्ज़ ghazi है, it comes from an Arabic, well, it is an Arabic word, right, which comes from a very old pre-Islamic Arab tradition of ghazwa. And that was a tradition of tribes raiding each other. Just like India, the India that we are looking at is not in any sense a unified entity where anybody feels loyal to anybody else. Similarly, the Arabian Peninsula, before Islam unified it, none of the Arab tribes felt at all bound to each other in any emotional or moral way. They made very practical alliances and they made very practical war. Now, Ghazwa isn't war. Ghazwa is a very specific thing, which was the tradition of one tribe raiding another tribe. that was one of the ways the tribe survived, one of the ways in which they increased their wealth. They would go raid another tribe, especially a traveling tribe, and take all their cattle. Because what was wealth for tribal Arabs in that time? It was cattle. तो इसको वो गजवा कहते थे. और जिस ट्राइब ने बहुत सारे सक्सेसफुल गजवा एक्सपीडिशंस किए हुए होते थे, वो उनको अपनी एक ट्राइबल हिस्ट्री में celebrate karte the. So every Arab tribe around the, in the lifetime of the Prophet and before him, right, this is pre-Islamic tribal tradition, used to have, there was a person in every tribe whose job was to remember and retell the history of the tribe. And he was a poet and a singer and a storyteller. These were his skill sets. And his job was to compose poems, to commemorate successful raids against other tribes, and then to sing or recite those poems to the tribe, and then make the next generation learn them. Tribal identity इसी चीज पे बनती थी, ठीक है? तो ये क्योंकि एक बहुत sort of precious Arab heritage था within Islam, it seeped into later Islamic history writing. So while Mahmud, coming from Afghanistan and raiding all various parts of North India, was doing a variety of things that all had a very practical purpose, when his court historians wrote about it, they wrote about it using the expected rhetoric of Ghazwa, कि वो गाजी थे और ग़ज़वा लड़ने गए थे इन्फिडल्स के खिलाफ. अच्छा, अब महमूद के बारे में इंटरेस्टिंग चीज़ ये है कि बिल्कुल मोहम्मद बिन कासिम की तरह वो जो ओरिजिनल impetus था to come across the Khyber Pass and into North India was that the central government in Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate had actually asked him, because he was on the border, the last Islamic kingdom on the border of Hindustan, he was asked to go into North India, this area, okay, look, this is Sindh, this is Upper Sindh, which was the area or the kingdom of Multan. In Mahmud's time, please pay attention now. In Mahmud's time, this area, this region of Multan was an Ismaili Shia kingdom. It had been established by the chief rivals of the Abbasids, who were the Fatimids, who had set up a rival caliphate in Egypt and controlled all of North Africa. So via the sea route, see, यहाँ से देखो ये इधर Arabian Peninsula होगा, तो यहाँ Egypt होगा, यूं करके वो आए होंगे सिंध में, और यहाँ जो मुल्तान का region था, it had a rather large and well-established Ismaili principality. So one of the main reasons Mahmud came was to deal with this Shia Ismaili outpost. And he did. He destroyed it by the end of his raids. रास्ते में जो मुनासिब लगा उन्होंने किया, because of course you spend a lot of money, you invest a lot in any military expedition. And why do you do that? At the end of the day, you do that because it's actually a business proposition. You invest in a conquest expecting to get higher benefits and profits over and above your initial investment by the end of it. So things like raiding the temple of Somnath were just that. War booty, B-O-O-T-Y, right? And you can read about it all the time. War booty means this. When people went to war, they needed to replenish their investment and costs. And so they took away whatever was of material value from the people or the places that they made war on. Umair.
Miss, I have a small question. So after the raid at Somnath temple, there's this line that says he ordered Shira's image to be broken up and its pieces taken back to Ghazni to be set on the floor and walked upon. So we know that its purpose was not religious. So what was the point of doing this? Why did he want to desecrate the image of Shira?
We don't know whether that actually happened, but it could easily have happened. Certainly, Mahmud himself was not insensitive to the symbolic value of being an idol breaker. It was definitely good PR for him also, but it was never the main reason that he came or did the things that he was doing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that is the rhetoric of the Persian Tariqs. There's another interesting aspect to this. You see, what happened is, had Mahmud and the Ghaznavids not become otherwise important in the wider context of Islamic history, then also maybe this incident wouldn't have been remembered in the way that it has been remembered. Mahmud became important, and the Ghaznavids weren't a long-lasting dynasty. There was Mahmud's father, and then there was Mahmud's son, and that's about it. But during the short period of about 30 years, 40 years that the dynasty existed, it did a bunch of things. One of the most important things that happened at the royal court in Ghazna, which is the city in Afghanistan where their capital was, hence they are the Ghaznavids, is that उस ज़माने में I wish अब भी होता हो, लेकिन in the pre-modern world, by and large everywhere, but especially across the Islamic world, rulers, small kings and sultans who wanted to show off or project themselves as particularly important and legitimate, they would keep these very luxurious and brilliant courts. अब इसमें बहुत elements हैं. How do you keep a brilliant court? What does that mean? It means your palace has to be beautiful and impressive. Fine, that's an external. It means that your capital city has to be beautiful and impressive and have like be a great place for trading and a central market for the region. Then there is the very important question of human resources. So your army has to be strong and impressive and terrifying. And finally, there needs to be a collection of artists and intellectuals associated with the court जो directly Sultan की नौकरी करते हैं. There is a court poet, there are many court poets, there are court historians, there are court painters, there are court philosophers. And these people are very important. And the smaller sultans, like the sultans of Ghazna in the Islamic world, used to compete with each other to attract the brightest minds of their time. And Mahmud was particularly successful at that. So, along with all this raiding and stuff that he was up to, he also patronized at his court some of the greatest intellectuals of his time. Among them was the poet Firdausi, who really is considered the father of Islamo-Persian literature. He is the author of the Shahnameh, which is one of the great classics of Perso-Islamic civilization and literature, the Shahnameh, and I'm sure you've all heard of it, Firdausi. He also employed probably one of the greatest intellectuals of all of Islamic history. There's a man called Al-Biruni, who was primarily a mathematician and an astronomer, not an astrologer. He didn't tell you what your star signs were saying. He was an astronomer, that is a mathematician who studied the movement of the stars. And he was very interested in spiritual philosophies across the world. Al-Biruni got this huge grant, really a grant from Mahmud, to come and spend years and years in India learning Sanskrit, hanging out with groups of Brahmin Pandits, and documenting and learning all their sciences. What was his primary interest? Let me repeat. Al-Biruni's primary interest was mathematics. And the leading mathematicians of the ancient world were from India. I'm assuming that all of you have heard this piece of trivia, but in case you haven't, I will tell you now. One of the things that ancient Indian mathematicians are well known for is the invention of zero. And I leave it up to you to imagine how that revolutionized mathematics. So it was well known as a land of advanced mathematicians. Al-Biruni इसलिए आए थे, लेकिन साथ साथ क्योंकि उस जमाने में कोई hard and fast boundaries नहीं होती थी between different disciplines of learning, everybody was a bit of a Renaissance man and knew a fair amount about everything, and knowledge was considered connected. अब हम बहुत दोबारा बात करते हैं आजकल के ज़माने में interdisciplinarity की और cross disciplinarity की, इसलिए कि in the modern world, especially in the 20th century, the Western academy worked really hard to separate different fields of learning in order to create specialization and to organize it. And there were very good things that came of that. But one of the bad things that came of this modern need to categorize and separate was that disciplines stopped talking to each other and stopped learning from each other. But in Al-Biruni's time, in Mahmud's time, in the 11th century, there was no such thing. In order to understand anything about the world, you needed to understand it from multiple perspectives and through many disciplines. So we are going to take some time, maybe next time, to look at Al-Biruni's Kitab al-Hind, to see the kinds of things he came here and learnt. But it's really important to remember that he only came because Mahmud had an interest in India, and Mahmud gave him a lot of money to come and do this. Yes, Umair, your hand's still up.
Miss, the Persian darbars, they're very synonymous to the Mughal darbars. So were they inspired by the Persians?
Of course. Where did they come from? The Mughals came from Central Asia, which was very much part of this Persianate world that Eaton is talking about. And these are their traditions. They didn't invent it. They didn't make it up. It was what they had learned. Okay, so Eaton then goes on to talk to us about how, despite the similarities between Rajendra Chola's raid, right? Rajendra Chola came from here and raided North India up here. And Mahmud came from here and raided all the way down here. Matlab, Lahore to conquer kiya na, Lahore and the area around it, northern Punjab became, and what we call KP today, and parts of Kashmir, all became part of the extended Ghaznavi Empire. This Indian dynasty, the Hindu Shahis, were destroyed. Ji Maham? Okay. And in his raiding, he came all the way down to here, but not much further. So we've talked about how the rhetoric and the style of Persian and Islamic Tarikh writing portrayed Mahmud as a Ghazi. Let's now think about and try to understand what was going on with the Cholas. What were they doing? Why did they attack a dynasty or a kingdom that was Indian and Hindu? Did they not have any fellow feeling? Did they not have any sense of loyalty to each other? So Eaton explains this to us through what? Can somebody remind us what are the two concepts from Sanskritic culture and Sanskritic literature that informed the activities of Rajendra Chola? Ji Huzafa.
अच्छा, तो एक तो मतलब उनकी पॉलिटिकल क्या कह सकते हैं, फिलोसफी कह सकते हैं कि जिस तरह वो देखना चाहते
पॉलिटिकल थियोरी भी कह सकते हैं।
हाँ, पॉलिटिकल थ्योरी के मतलब मंडाला सिस्टम जो होता है, जिस तरह आपने वो बताई थी हमें कि कॉन्सेंट्रिक सर्कल्स होते हैं जिसमें उन्होंने रखा होता है, ठीक है, दरमियान में एक खुद होते हैं, ठीक है, जैसे चोलाज की जो मेन पॉइंट था, जो फलक्रम था जिसके गिर्द सारे घूम रहे थे, वो खुद थे, ठीक है, जैसे तंजावुर या जो उनका इलाका था, ठीक है। फिर उसके बाद एक सर्कल आता है जो कि उनके एलाइज का होता है, ठीक है, जो उनके हलीफ होते हैं। फिर उनके बाद एक और सर्कल आता है जो कि एनिमीज़ का होता है, ठीक है, जो हरीफ होते हैं, जिनके साथ मुकाबला होता है। फिर एक और सर्कल आता है जो कि मतलब न्यूट्रल्स होते हैं या फिर जिनके साथ एलाइज बना सकते, वो उनको हलीफ बना सकते हैं, ठीक है। और एक और था कि एक और कॉन्सेप्ट था जिसमें वो ये था कि एक बादशाह अजीम तब होता है जब वो मशरिक मगरब और शुमाल और जनूब की तरफ वो फ़ौज कशी करता है, तभी वो बन सकता है, यानी अज़मत का हामिल हो सकता है। तो ये भी एक कॉन्सेप्ट था जिसके तहत वो जो राजेंद्र था, मतलब राजा था, मेरे ख्याल में राजा द फर्स्ट था, पता नहीं कौन, और उसने जो है मशरिक मगरब शुमाल जनूब की तरफ फ़ौज कशी की, और उसके बेटे ने भी इस तरह ही किया फिर।
Thank you. Very nicely explained. Arisha. Actually, hang on, Arisha. Jyoti?
So Minister Zephyr said they had a whole system of ruling strategically. What they wanted to do is that put themselves in the center and have allies in the neighboring areas, and then basically have those kinds of allies who are the enemies of their enemies, right? So it was a whole system of ruling. They would actually want to rule in this way, and then yeah, this is basically what I wanted to say in a very short, because Zephyr said everything.
Okay. Arisha?
Yes. Miss, adding to Huzafa's point, as Huzafa has already mentioned, that interpolitics result in the creation of states of city, also known as mandala, where the center is the heart, home, second circle, allies, and the third enemies, like as we can say chess. What was also common in that time was loyal vassals, also we can commonly call as subordinate. When victorious northern expedition happened and Rajendra fought and win, he conquered and make some of the rulers as loyal vassals, so that he can rule over them, and I transform his neighboring enemies into subordinates.
Okay, great. Let's look at it now. So you guys seem to, Ramin, you want to say anything?
Yeah, no, I just have a question. So mandalas kind of have this spiritual connotation as well, like they're like meant in like certain faiths, I think part of Buddhism as well, and recently they've come to mean like as an art form, as in they've come to represent like the cosmos and stuff. So was this model kind of spiritually inspired as well, or was it like solely for political purposes?
No,
or
you're absolutely right. It's a way of looking at the world, and it's a very Indic way of looking at the world. So you get it across genres of Sanskrit literature. It is certainly a way in which the Sanskritic literature will describe the universe or the cosmos. It is a way to understand their hierarchy of celestial beings, which I know many of you are struggling with. It went into Buddhism and changed considerably to reflect the Buddha's teachings. But it's a recurring motif, just explaining things through the motif of concentric circles. And political theory was just one of the many things that were explained or understood, actually understood through the symbol of the concentric circle. You'll get this, and there's actually a very nice short little journalistic article on this, which I'll share with you. The text through which we have the clearest, most detailed explanation of the mandal or mandala is a text called the Artha Shastra, which is attributed to a philosopher called Chanakya, who was lived at and was patronized by the court of the Mauryas, that is the dynasty of Ashoka the Great. It's a text that was probably added to and revised and so on for a couple of centuries after its initial composition. In the Arthashastra, and the Arthashastra is a very famous text, right? So in global history, when historians put together lists of the most influential texts of the ancient world, the Arthashastra will often be in there. The basic idea of the mandala theory is if your neighbor is your natural enemy, then your neighbor's neighbor is your natural ally, right? My enemy's enemy is my friend. The states which are one's neighbors and are also neighbors of one's enemies, ab ye bhi hota hai na, you have buffer states who are your neighbors, but they are also neighbors of your enemies. Phir unke saath alliance ya neutrality zaruri hoti hai. This circle is dynamic, which means it keeps changing. And the king who's at the center, any king, right? This is always from the point of view of different kings, should strive to expand his central position and to reduce the power of the other kings around his concentric circles. So you should build alliances with states that are 2 degrees away from the center to create a balance of power. So look at this. This is you in the middle. This here, the light red first concentric circle, are considered enemies. Like your immediate neighbors are definitely considered enemies. Why do you think that is? Why shouldn't your immediate neighbors be friends?
I guess it was sort of understood that जो immediate neighbors होंगे, they like उनके साथ ही सबसे पहले उनके temples और उनकी जो चीजें होंगी वो plunder की जाएंगी. और it was assumed that क्योंकि उन लोगों की भी understanding होगी कि वो हम पे attack करेंगे, तो दोनों की एक मतलब mutual understanding होगी कि ये मंडला की के एक दूसरे के ऊपर इस तरह attack हो सकता है और एक दूसरे की जो riches हैं वो लूट की जा सकती है. That's why I guess.
Yeah, sure. Aisha, haven't heard from you yet.
Miss, maybe because even अगर किसी को कोई further expedition भी करना है तो उसके लिए जो route होगा उसके लिए सबसे पहले आपको अपने neighbors को invade करना पड़ेगा. So even if you want to have an alliance with them, you can never be sure कि वो आप पे attack ना करें because you are the closest to them. और उनका जो invasion है और उनका जो expansion है वो सबसे पहले आपसे ही start होगा. So it's like you can never trust each other.
Exactly. You all saying more or less the same thing, that everybody's immediate. आपके लिए जो इस सर्कल में होगा उन सब के लिए आप इस सर्कल में होंगे, right? Which means that yes, your immediate neighbors are the easiest, closest places for you to begin your own expansion. What is the goal of the game? To expand outwards as far as possible into these circles. The people who are, or the states or princes who are beyond your circle of immediate neighbors who are hostile, those become your allies so that you can join hands to attack your common enemies from 2 different sides. अच्छा, अगर successfully आप और आपके पर्पल सर्कल वाले एलाइज जो हैं वो ये लाल सर्कल मिटा देते हैं, तो फिर क्या होगा? फिर ये क्या होगा?
मिस फिर वो आपके एनिमी बन जाएंगे, आपके
फिर
एलाय।
वो आपके पहले सर्कल में आ जाएंगे. So that's what he means by saying that the mandala is always dynamic. The people who are your enemies and your allies keep changing depending on your position in the world. Jyoti?
Miss, I actually have a question. I think you pretty much answered it, but how can you actually trust your enemy's enemy? I mean, how can you?
Very simply, right? Because you have the same common interest. So you only trust them temporarily.
Yeah, but how do you know कि जो आपका neighbor का, you know, like your neighbor's neighbor, who's your ally, will not actually trust or, you know, like betray you and then, you know, mingle with your enemy and then, you know, like just attack you. And
very good question. And it's explained, at least in this theoretical basis, it's explained by the existence of this common enemy. And the defeat of this common enemy is what allows this ally and this ally to temporarily cooperate. So it's not really a question of trust. It's a question of judgment, of knowing कि इस circle वाला prince जो है, he very badly wants to make war on and get rid of a prince from this circle. And when you know that, which you would know because of your circle of spies and intelligence workers, then you know that he needs you. It's a case of mutual need, not trust. Sarim.
Yes, miss. I just wanted to ask, wouldn't that depend on the level of threat the enemy or that person poses? For example, in Greece, they used to fight each other, but whenever the Persians used to attack, all of them used to unite and fight against them because they realized that was a bigger threat than them.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. No such thing happened in India, which is really why there was so many waves of outside invaders who happened to all be Muslim, because that entire millennium, Islam was the dominant and expanding global civilization. But no, this idea of allying together, right? Because somebody from outside is coming from here or here, it didn't exist. What was a Hindu ruler concerned with? Expanding his own circle of influence out into the mandala. Now, what is the other concept that Eaton talks about, which explains this need for expansion? एक तो मंडला का कॉन्सेप्ट है, दूसरा क्या है? जी अरीशा.
I guess Digvijaya.
Digvijaya, right? Or Digvijaya.
Clockwise expedition.
हाँ, Digvijay. So what does that mean?
I guess clockwise expedition, by making vessels and expanding their authority and ruling over.
Anyone else? If you have the text open in front of you, there's actually a place where he defines it properly. Find it for me. I'm waiting.
Conquest of the quarter.
That's right. Where is this? Just so other people know.
It's page 36 of the PDF.
36 of the PDF. Yes, I'm so sorry. Your PDF doesn't have page numbers. 36 of the PDF. That's right. It's 25 of the book. It's the end of the first paragraph on page 36 of the PDF. Just as importantly, these conquests validated the Cholas' claims to becoming universal emperor, Chakravartin. Chakra, and you know what that means. Chakra kya hota hai? Gold chakra, right? This is the universe in its round form. Chakravartin, universal emperor, the one who conquers and controls the whole chakra of life. According to classical Indian political thought, such an emperor, a Chakravartin, has to perform Digvijaya or Digvijaya, a conquest of the quarters. That is, a conquest of kingdoms to the south, west, north, and east. Those are the quarters. तो आपको अगर दिग्विजय establish करनी है, तो आपको यहाँ भी conquest करनी है, यहाँ भी करनी है, यहाँ भी करनी है, और यहाँ भी करनी है. The 4 directions or the 4 quarters. So that is what Rajendra Chola was up to when he turned up in Bengal. What is the other, and one of you mentioned it, I want to say it was, I don't know who it was, Ayaz or Josefa. There was another curious thing that Rajendra Chola did while he was up north raiding. What is it that he did? Yes, he destroyed temples. Yes, he picked up idols and took them back with him. He, made war. But what was one curious thing that he did? Tayyaba.
Yes, he led the first naval expedition.
No. Iman?
He basically asked his troops to collect water from the river in mud pots and take it back to his capital.
River?
The Ganges River.
Why? Anyone? Yes, Ali.
It was because in Hindu mythology, it is said that the river Ganges is a blessing from the gods. के उन्होंने इसको मतलब as a blessing दिया था इस पूरे मैदान को मतलब irrigate करने के लिए. तो उसके synonymous उसने अपनी एक image बनानी थी. उसका फिर एक नाम बन गया था. I don't recall the name perfectly, but उनके नाम के साथ ही जुड़ गया था ऐसा कि the man who brought Ganges. इस तरह की good translation बनती है.
That's right, and it's in the chat. Thanks, Arisha. Hamna?
I just wanted to say the same point that they wanted to sanctify their own country by taking the water from there.
So there's this symbolic religious sanctification of this area down south जहाँ गंगा आती नहीं है. See, गंगा यहाँ शुरू कहीं होती है और यूं साउथ ईस्ट करके बहती है down into the Bay of Bengal. So it is a very North Indian phenomenon, but it has this place in the Vedic literature that is supreme. It's even more important than Abe Zamzam for Muslims, for instance. That's the closest analogy. So Rajendra Chola is symbolically, he did many things that were important in the mandala symbolism, but he symbolically brings the water of the Ganges, and actually it's as though he's transported and made the Ganga itself in his kingdom in South India, which of course would have been a source of great pride, making the Cholas even more important in the eyes of their neighbors. So if everybody, look at how many major, छोटी dynasties तो और भी थी, यहाँ तो इन्होंने सिर्फ major dynasties लिखी हैं, यहाँ पांड्यास, यहाँ चेरास, यहाँ चोलास, पालास, सेनास, चंडेलास, कालाचूरीस, Paramaras, Solankis, Chauhans. There are so many, and they are all thinking of themselves as the center of their own mandala. And they are all at war with each other constantly. So they are all looking inwards, right? Does anybody remember what Eaton says about chess? What does he say about chess, the game of chess?
Chess originated in India. It's like similar to this mandala के आपने इस तरह के strategically move करना होता है and destroy the enemy.
Omer, you want to add anything?
I just want to quote the direct line because he puts it in a very nice way. It's like a large chessboard on which kings maneuvered with allies and against rivals with a view to creating an idealized political space called the Circle of States.
Right. Thank you. So, ये एक अपने सेल्फ कंटेन्ड से चेस बोर्ड पे अपने काम कर रहे थे within a set of rules that everybody understood, right? So within the world of Sanskritic cultures, people understood these things. It was as these were the rules of the game. Warfare has its own rules, right? These were the rules of politics and warfare. Sorry, and only the princes who were within this Sanskritic world understood it. And so they were by and large interested in each other. Actually, by the way, there's a place outside the Indian subcontinent mentioned by Eaton, which was raided by the Cholas. Josefa.
Sri Lanka or Sumatra?
Where is Sumatra?
Indonesia.
Indonesia. Sorry, this map doesn't have it. But if you look at one of the bigger maps that I've given you before, see down here starts Southeast Asia, which is Indonesia and Malaysia. And the large island of Sumatra is sort of probably somewhere here. And I hope everybody knows that Indonesia in particular has a very high percentage of Hindu communities. So Vedic, Sanskritic, Hindu religion spread beyond the subcontinent eastwards. ये north east में तो Buddhism गई ना. Buddhism eventually migrated completely into Tibet and China, etc. But Vedic religion moved this way. तो Burma में भी है, Southeast Asia में भी है, and historically these regions have been connected by trade and religion and politics and warfare. So the Cholas, because of their naval strength and their placement on this coast, the southeastern coast of India, also raided in this direction. And Sumatra was actually for a long time part of the Chola Empire. So introductory chapter mein, when Eaton gave you guys an introduction to this idea of a Sanskritic world and a Persianate world, he means all these other regions jahan pe the dominant culture is the culture carried in main major Sanskrit texts. Of course, there are very different forms of Vedic-based religion that are practiced in Southeast Asia and in Burma, but they're also connected. And they all look back they trace their origins from basic common Sanskrit texts, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Puranas. Okay, I think that wraps it up for today. And look what good time we made. Happy to take a few questions, Sarim.
Yes, miss, about the circle, I wanted to ask, maybe my net got disconnected, but like, why was one circle not complete, the last circle?
Because it's, I think, just the way that this particular graphic was made, that it's assumed कि ये चलता रहेगा. It's a way of showing you that this is never ending, right? Concentric circles is kind of never ending.
Okay, thank you.
Rahma.
Miss, I just have this question that the alliances between these states as shown in the Mandala politics, was it similar to what we would now call secret diplomacy, or were their alliances openly proclaimed?
Both. I mean, that's the short answer, both. So this Sanskrit text-based political theory, particularly as it is outlined in Chanakya's Arthashastra, is extremely extremely practical. I mean, just look at this, right? It is, there's no moral high ground. There's nothing, heroic or, moral about it. That's what he means when he says the circle is dynamic. Ramin?
Yeah, so in like the mandala, if the center of the like this like the mid oh my god, if the centermost circle is the ruler, and you know how everything is kind of like layered around that, do the immediate enemies of that circle also like acknowledge that center area as like
Of
the
course
ruling
not.
party, or is it
Of course not. Each ruler is at the center of his own mandala. That's the problem.
okay? So every mandala is kind of like, so every circle is like the center of another circle, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, okay.
Sarin.
Yes, miss. I also wanted to ask that do you feel that because of this, following this philosophy, the Indians were unable to, to resist outside conquerors because this kind of created more and more disunity amongst each other?
Yes, yes. There was, okay, let's take a few steps back. The way you phrased that question, think about it. The way you phrased it and the way we would all tend to phrase it, the implication is that unifying, coming together is a positive thing, right? That it's a given. Unity to achhi hoti hai. But it's not. It's again one of the things we value both as Muslims and as modern people. But for pre-modern Sanskritic cultures in India, that was like, they would have laughed at you. Chanakya would have laughed at you at the idea that this mandala should be converted into maybe a square or a line where everybody's holding hands with each other and repelling a common enemy. The concept of unifying with your political rivals was ridiculous and laughable. It was not a positive thing. It was an idiotic, stupid, bad thing. And so they did not have the advantages that military alliance and unity could bring to them, where they could band together and repel an outside enemy. The other reason, of course, is, as we talked about in the early discussion on Mahmud, that anybody who was at the receiving end of an outside attack, Gujarat ko le lo, the area where the temple of Somnath happens to be, to them, every outsider was equally threatening. And an outsider is just somebody outside their immediate boundaries. And it seems that they were not so upset by Mahmud's raids as they were terrified of future raids by a more immediate neighbor against whom they first built a walled city and a fort. Mahmud to dur se aata tha aur kabhi kabhi aata tha. It's like, he's like a buzzing fly that they swat away, who does a little bit of damage and then is off. The immediate neighbor, because of the mandala, the immediate neighbor is much more scary and much more threatening. And because the immediate neighbor is much more scary and much more threatening, somebody like Mahmud coming from here is also thought of as less of a threat. Iman.
I just wanted to ask that, is it possible that your immediate neighbor is your ally and then surrounding your ally is your enemy? So in case your enemy wants to attack you, your ally will protect you.
Yeah. See, here it is. There's states which are one's neighbors, but also neighbors of one's enemy are neutral and should always be treated with respect. Beach mein buffer states bhi hote hain. So returning to the sort of extended answer I was giving to Sarim's question, try not to stand in judgment. Just try to understand this historical context on its own terms. 11th century India was full of Kshatriya dynasties who shared a similar worldview based on the same sets of Sanskrit texts that they were all reading. And it was kind of part of their mindset to constantly make war with each other. The result of this was, as Sarin rightly pointed out, that it then became difficult for them to withstand any major invasion or attack from outside. There's one last thing that Eaton mentions. When a king has done very well, मतलब के पूरे मंडला पे दिग्विजय इस्टेब्लिश कर ली है, conquest of the quarters, फिर उसको क्या करना होता है to maintain his position and prove that he's a great king? What does anybody with aspirations to Chakravartan have to do? जी हुज़ैफा।
तो जिस तरह मतलब वो सब कुछ कर लेता है तो मतलब वो अजीम हो जाता है और फिर सारे लोगों की नजरें उसके ऊपर होती हैं। तो जो वेसल्स उसने बनाए होते हैं, जो
वेसल क्या होता है हुज़ैफा? मेरा ख्याल है काफी मुश्किल लफ्ज है।
अच्छा, जो उसके जो मतलब उसको सपोर्ट करते हैं, जो उसके हलीफ होते हैं, ठीक है, यानी और फिर इस तरह होता है। कुछ वेसल्स ऐसे होते हैं जो कि मतलब रुपया देते हैं, ठीक है, कुछ ऐसे होते हैं जो कि आपको फौज आपकी मदद करते हैं, ठीक है, और आप उनकी मदद करते हैं, ठीक है।
They're basically lesser rulers and lesser tribal leaders and so on who can't be kings in their own right, so they pay allegiance to some great king. But होते वो leaders हैं अपने छोटे context में, तो उनको फिर vassal वो बड़े king के vassal बन जाते हैं।
सही। लेकिन फिर ये होता है कि जब आपको पूरी तरह अज़मत हासिल हो जाती है तो फिर आप उनको उसी तरह के गिफ्ट भी देते हैं, ठीक है, और उसी तरह के टाइटल्स देते हैं और उसी तरह की मुराद उनको हासिल हो जाती है वेसल्स को, ठीक है। तो इसका नतीजा ये होता है कि जो आपका कंट्रोल होता है वो आहिस्ता आहिस्ता से कमज़ोर होना शुरू हो जाता है। जो वेसल्स होते हैं वो उठना शुरू हो जाते हैं, उनका उरूज आना शुरू हो जाता है और आहिस्ता ऐसे होता है कि आपका ज़ौफ़ इतना बढ़ जाता है कि वो वेसल्स ही आपको हड़प कर जाते हैं आखिर में। और
That's right. Thank you, Zephyr. So again, this business of the political landscape, which is a mandala, always being dynamic, also means that if a ruler actually manages to achieve something close to Digvijay, which is conquest all across the quarters and these concentric circles, then it becomes incumbent on him to start giving away his land to his vassals, more and more of his land and his wealth to his vassals. This is not just a ritual obligation, it's also a material obligation because armies कैसे बनती थी उस जमाने में? कोई स्टैंडर्ड नेशनल आर्मी तो होती नहीं थी जिसमें सैलरीड सोल्जर्स होते थे। ये बाय द वे इस्लामी दुनिया में होता था, which is one of the things that was different there, the idea of a professional soldier. यहाँ और यूरोप में यहाँ भी ऐसा होता था that it was the tribal chieftains, the local rajas and so on, all the leaders who were under you, they are the ones who had direct access to human resources. So each little raja or chieftain who was under a king would bring a contingent of soldiers to a major war or battle. He would supply men and weapons to his king. What would he needed to get something in return? Remember, warfare is business with an investment and a profit. So if a king was successful, then he had to give all his vassals, who are basically his investors, their profits back. Ifra?
Yes, miss. So I had a question about Mahmud Ghaznavi.
Okay.
Why didn't he go further into the east of India? Now, I understand that he didn't have any religious objective, but still you do have the objective of expansion. And since you're coming and going, like you're coming to Somnath and from time to time.
Did he have the objective of expansion? Did he ever try to establish a permanent presence in Gujarat?
No, I mean like wouldn't any ruler want that? Like, isn't that part of becoming a ruler? Expansion?
महमूद जो है वो मंडलानी बना रहा था.
No, I mean just generally any, like for example, if I take any Greek ruler as well, like Alexander the Great. Anyone would want.
Alexander is very unique amongst the Greeks. In fact, they disapproved of him very much for wanting to conquer the world. And again, this concept of conquest being an admirable thing, this is also sort of European, because the Europeans admired the Roman Empire that unified Europe and civilized it, right? So they think of great big empires as good things. And so do we in Islam, right? Because the same thing happened. However, every culture does not think of expansion as a great thing. For Mahmud, he didn't have the resources necessarily for that kind of expansion. It takes a lot of resources. Look, if you expand over a very large area, how do you hold it without modern communications? It's very, very hard. Do you remember we looked at this map which was showing us the Kushan kingdom that extended like around from here to here? और जब वो यहाँ तक आया तो उनको 2 capitals बनाने पड़े थे क्योंकि वो इतनी बड़ी territory जो थी एक capital से नहीं चला सकते थे. So no, I mean Mahmud had a bunch of different motivations to come, but remember prophet. If you keep the analogy or metaphor of prophet in your mind always, then it answers the question you're asking. It would not have been profitable for Mahmud to expand elsewhere. He did take control of Punjab, the northern areas, and parts of Kashmir because it was easy. They were right next to his own kingdom. He could administer them from there. Secondly, one of his major missions for coming into India was to destroy the Fatimid Shia Ismaili principality of Multan, which was in this area, which he did, and he annexed it. So he brought all of this northern area up to the province of Multan. By annexing it to the Ghaznavid kingdom, he made it officially part of Darul Islam under the Sunni Abbasids. And that was it. His mandate didn't really, and his ambition didn't extend beyond that. The rest was for fun and war booty and to pay his soldiers something. See, the temple of Somnath and other temples along the way that were raided, why were they raided? Because certain temples, particularly in this period when temples were a symbol of the importance and wealth and legitimacy of Kshatriya rulers, their temples used to be magnificent. The idols were made of solid gold. Their clothes and jewelry were made of real precious jewels. So the stuff is really valuable. And picking it up and running off with it is so much easier than going and raiding a treasury or something more complicated. It's like a quick fix war booty. And that's what he was doing. It was very easy to just come down this way, raid. Somnath is where it ended. Somnath had particularly big and expensive and valuable idols, so it made sense to come all the way down there. But going beyond was rather more difficult and complex and expensive. ये करके वापस चले जाते थे बस. Does that make it any clearer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Sarah?
Miss, was this motive of annexing or like making the Shias a part of the Abbasid rule, was it hidden because it's not included, like it's not specifically mentioned in the book?
No, because we don't know a lot about it. Certainly, there is some documentation of it more on the Ismaili side, actually, because they didn't really want to even acknowledge them. No? It was a Fatimid principality, but it was a danger, it was a threat. It was right there on the border here, and quite strong. So it was systematically destroyed, and actually elite Ismaili leaders in this region were actively rounded up and executed or run out of the place. Actually, Muhammad bin Qasim did the same thing in Sindh. There was, and this is documented, there was an active pursuit of the Shia rebels that he had come after, and as many as he found were publicly executed. Rahma?
Miss, we spoke about this in the beginning of the class, how invasions and raids were commonplace in that time. So I just wanted to ask
There's
that
a big difference between an invasion and a raid, okay?
Okay. So I just wanted to ask why these invasions are not held at the same ethical standard as Western colonization.
Ethical? Because they're not invasions, they're raids. An invasion means that you want to hold the territory that you have raided, and you want to sit there and continue to extract resources from it in the long term.
All right.
What do you mean it's not held to the same ethical standards? Just explain it.
I was thinking that for the longest time, I haven't really thought about these, invasions as, as negatively as I have thought about colonization.
Oh, you mean the Muslim invasions? Because you're not taught to think about them negatively. You're taught, socialized to think about them positively.
Yeah, so that was my question.
Yeah, sure. That's a very different question. Yeah, that's all. There's no other answer to that. It's just, it's a question of where we are located, where you and I are located, and how history is fed to us, right? There's always a certain historical narrative, which we've talked about at great length. Ali.
Yeah.
Ma'am, you repeatedly mentioned that Multan was a Fatimid principality. So, like we've understood that a principality is somewhere, somewhere that a prince gets his title from, or that's ruled by a prince.
It's not quite a kingdom. Like it's a smaller political unit that doesn't have aspirations to sovereignty. A king is sovereign. I mean, that's what all this terminology means. Whereas this little state around Multan acknowledged and accepted the sovereignty of the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Okay, guys, I hope everybody got the message that there is no tutorial tomorrow. Whoever signed up for tomorrow's tutorial will need to come in for it exactly 2 weeks from now. The day of the week and the time are exactly the same. It's just that it's not this Friday, but 2 Fridays from now. Ji Hamna.
Ms. Arya, we just wanted to ask that the quiz that we have next week, it would be like over the weekend, similar to the one we had before?
Yeah, absolutely. Jab classes khatam ho jayengi, wahi Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Okay, and like it would be MCQs only, like short
Same
question
sort of
answers
thing
as well?
same sort of thing that you experienced before.
Okay, thank you.
All right, guys. Take care. Khuda Hafiz.